From 1985 to 1991, there existed a company that primarily produced Amiga games called Cinemaware, and the gimmick of their games was that they were heavily inspired by the cinema. Now you'd think that this would mean all their games would be cinematic, which isn't the case. It was more that they took the cinema as an inspiration. By 1989 they'd already made several good games like Defender of the Crown and Lords of the Rising Sun, influenced by Robin Hood and samurai movies respectively, and they'd sort of got a reputation for blending a series of genres together and linking them with several mini-games, some of them more successful than others. Then they released It Came From The Desert, and this was a game I actually had a chance to play on the Random DOS game show, and I got to play the DOS version, which has a poorer colour palette. Though the trade-off is it also has MT32 music, which I didn't utilise at the time, and that's what you're hearing in the background now. After playing through it in full, I discovered that there was a Amiga version, and that it was the original version, but it was also the best version. And if you want to play through that in much higher quality, feel free to check the link in my description. I'll be using the Amiga footage in this discussion. It Came From a Desert is based off 1950s horror movies. Those cheaply produced ones that you'd see in a drive-in movie theatre with your gal at your arm, terrified and clinging to you. You star as Dr. Greg Bradley, a geologist, who is turned up at Lizard's Breath in California to observe a pile of rocks. Greg is definitely not Indiana Jones. He's a geologist, not an archaeologist, though he's very much cut from the same cloth, most likely having fought in the war as well. So after coming to study meteors, Greg's appearance is quite opportune, because within a month of his being there, a giant meteor comes crashing down onto the landscape. So you're probably looking at this and you're thinking, first-person perspective, it's clearly a point-and-click adventure game. You know, like Rise of the Dragon, the last game I talked about. Well, it's not really. Sure, there's a narrative and there's people to talk to, but there's no real inventory or puzzles to speak of. Lizard's Breath is a desert town. It's delightfully rural, and it's described by our hero as a tumbleweed rest stop of sorts. He's visited by a grizzled old prospector called Geese and his donkey, who provides him with an interesting sample from the latest meteor crash. He has his assistant Biff analyse it, and they find out that it's radioactive. So Greg sends the samples to the lab, and then it's off to the pub to see exactly where Geese got these from. Upon wetting the old prospector's whistle, you get the exact location of where the crash happened, and you go out there and inspect it, thus leading to the first of our mini-games. It Came From the Desert is not ambiguous about the threat, and you immediately run into a giant ant. And this leads to a shooting gallery game that you are destined to lose. Why is that? Because you lack the knowledge that's needed to win. Only one part of the giant ant is vulnerable to your gun, and you don't know what it is yet. So unless you get extremely lucky or you look through a walkthrough, you'll end up in hospital and lose precious time. Oh yes, this is all in real time as well. Of course you can save time by humorously escaping the hospital, but let's not do that. Gradually the locals report more and more strange occurrences happening, including a cow with a missing head. And if you head out there, you encounter another giant ant, who the farmer is very quick to get away from. Armed with your knowledge that the ant's antennae are the dangerous bit, you're into the next mini-game. Yes, a pile of ants will come swarming towards you, and you have to destroy or drive them off with a pile of grenades. So Greg, why didn't you use the grenades in the first place? Next, it's off to the lab to find out the results of the meteorite sample we sent in. And this is a very important part of the game, because you can send additional samples that you find from the ants in order to convince the scientist, the populace, and eventually the mayor that, hey, there's a giant ant invasion and we're kind of doomed if you don't do something about it. The doctor in the lab is described as H.G. Wells, the great man himself, which is a bit off, really. You see, It Came from the Desert is set in 1951. H.G. Wells was dead by that point, having died in London in the 40s. This makes this H.G. Wells an imposter, a fake, a fraud! Well, I mean, it could have been his son, G.P. Wells, who was actually a zoologist who specialised in invertebrates, except that he was part of the zoology department in the University College of London at the time. Silly game. London is not in California. This is completely immersion breaking. The imposter analyses samples that you find, and the game is very handy in that it points out when you've discovered samples, and tells you, gosh, I better send this to the lab. He also tells you cool facts about ants, like how if you shoot out their antenna they'll collapse. Lab results take time. Time which allows you to return to your home base and go to sleep. Because when there's a giant ant invasion on the cusp of swarming through the town, you need a bit of shut-eye. In addition to sleeping, your base also allows you to make phone calls to various places, interact with your assistant Biff on occasion, and sometimes a few other people as well. So there's giant ants on the loose, imminent destruction of mankind. What does Greg do next? That's right, get caught up in the affairs of the locals. What's most bizarre is Greg's insistence on dealing with the 1950s greasers, the Hellcats. And that's pretty much the game. You talk to various people in the town and you slowly build up enough evidence to make a case to the mayor, to bring in the National Guard and the army and to sort out this whole mess. Except that's not all that happens. In addition to dealing with some 50s greaser antagonists, Greg runs into a damsel in distress. Jackie Monroe's car is forced off the road, and her friend is missing. Conveniently, this happens right near where you live, so you head out to the car and investigate. And the result? Giant ant. You'll be seeing a lot of giant ants. You'll be shooting a lot of giant ants. What's interesting about this encounter with Jackie Monroe is that you can refuse to help her. You can just tell her to go away. This leads to branching paths depending upon how you treat the townsfolk of Lizard Breath. You can doom everybody, and yourself, if you don't do things correctly, or you can speed the game along and sort out the problem in record time if you just pay a bit of attention. So after blowing up a series of ants like your Arnie in Commando, eventually certain other areas in the town will open. This shows just what an eccentric place Lizard Breath is. You have a strange fortune teller, a somewhat simple gas attendant, and some kind of weird cultist. The game doesn't railroad you in a specific direction, but just like with the samples, it does offer hints as to what to do next. You visit various places and they'll give you a nudge in the right direction. You don't have to follow it necessarily, but it's nice. Next step? Playing chicken with the Hellcats. They come at you with their car, and suddenly you're in a driving section, and you have to head straight forward and force them off the road. You start to investigate the surrounding mines, keep getting interrupted by ants, and then it's on to the next minigame. What a geologist does best. Knife fighting. This is one of the more pointless sections of the game, but you know, it's a fun diversion. You get to stab people, laughs were had. So in addition to gathering up a pile of evidence and working in tandem with the not H.G. Wells in the lab, you get involved in a love triangle, you fight with 50s greasers, you deal with a cult, and a murder investigation to boot. All in a day's work for a standard geologist, really. Gradually the town becomes more and more convinced that, hey, this geologist dude might be right. All these giant ants we're seeing might mean there's giant ants about. It was the radiation from the meteorite that caused all this, in true horror movie fashion. But the last man, and the man that you need to convince the most, is the mayor. And you will need to pick up just about every bit of evidence you possibly can before he finally relents, packs his own bags and says, alright, have at it. From there the town grabs their guns and decides to fight back against the ant invasion. and you're left in charge, allowing you to delegate the militia and the police and the army to various areas in the game as you search for the Queen's Nest. And that's the final puzzle. You have to locate where the Queen is and blow her to Kingdom Come. And it's not easy. The most entertaining part of it came from the desert, aside from the branching plot lines and the real-time environment, is that there are lull periods. Periods of unease that are punctuated by the soundtrack. You know that the invasion is imminent, but sometimes there are these quiet moments where everything just seems to have returned to normal, and you're just waiting for the next terrible thing to happen. Overall, considering it was released in the late 80s, this is an excellent title, and you can tell it was influential as well. A film was made of it. Okay, not a very good film, but one was made of it. There was a sequel/expansion pack. There was an entirely different FMV-based game made of it. And it clearly inspired some major developers, including Dynamics, Sierra, Westwood. So if you feel like visiting a remote desert town with a 50s horror vibe, you could do a lot worse than It Came from the Desert. And I recommend you play it if you enjoy narrative-based, real-time, first-person adventure games. Though if you do have a thing against creepy crawlies, then you might want to avoid this one. Watch out for the ants.